The war had been going on for 11 years. 11 long, bloody, exhausting years. Humanity had lost cities. The Valkyrie Empire had lost fleets. Nobody was winning. Everyone was just losing slower than the other side. Captain Jake Miller had seen enough of it. He was 34 years old and already felt 60. His unit was small, tired, and running low on everything: food, ammo, and patience. They had been chasing a signal through the ruins of an old outpost when they found her, not hiding, not running, just standing there in the smoke, armor cracked, weapons dropped, staring at them like she was almost relieved it was over. General Vera. Jake knew the name. Everyone did. She was the Valkyrie Empire's most dangerous commander, the one responsible for 3 major human defeats, the one they called the Iron Hand, on their side of the war. And here she was, standing in the rubble alone, surrounded by Jake's 6-man team pointing rifles at her. Nobody spoke for a solid 10 seconds. Then Jake lowered his weapon and said, "Take her in." He honestly expected chaos after that. He expected the Empire to demand her release, or threaten retaliation, or send a rescue team. What he did not expect was what actually happened. The Empire sentenced her to death, not for fighting humans, not for losing the battle, for the simple, cold reason that she had been captured. In the Valkyrie Empire, getting caught by the enemy was considered the worst kind of failure. A general who could not die on the battlefield was a general who had embarrassed the Empire. And the Empire did not forgive embarrassment. The execution order came through official channels 2 days later. It was short, formal, and brutal in the way only bureaucratic language can be. Jake read it twice just to make sure he understood it correctly. Then he walked down to the lower level of the base where they were holding her and stood outside the cell door. A guard handed Vera the printed order through the slot in the door. Jake watched her read it. She stood perfectly straight, didn't sit down, didn't pace, didn't say a word. Her eyes moved across the page once, slowly, and then she folded it in half and set it on the small shelf beside her. Then she just stood there, looking at the wall, like she was doing math in her head. No shaking, no reaction, nothing. Jake stood there longer than he needed to. He told himself he was just making sure the prisoner was secure. But that wasn't really it. Something about watching her read her own death sentence and not flinch. It stuck with him in a way he couldn't quite shake off. He had seen soldiers get bad news before. He had delivered some of it himself. People cried. People got angry. People went quiet in a way that scared you more than yelling would. That was normal. That was human. But Vera just folded the paper and put it down like it was a grocery receipt. Jake walked back upstairs, poured himself a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and drank it anyway. He had a prisoner to hold until the Imperial executioner arrived. That was the job. Simple, clean, no complications. He kept telling himself that. He almost believed it too. Jake had one job: hold the prisoner, keep her secure, don't cause problems, wait for the executioner to arrive, and hand her over. Clean, simple, professional. He managed to stick to that plan for about 18 hours. It started small. The base kitchen had made extra portions that evening, and Jake noticed Vera's food tray was about half of what everyone else was getting. He didn't think too hard about it. He just grabbed a second tray and walked it down himself, slid it under the bars without saying anything, turned around to leave. Then she spoke. "You feed the animal before you slaughter it." Her English was clean, almost too clean, like someone who had learned it from books rather than conversations. Jake stopped walking. He should have kept going. He didn't. He turned around and said, "You're not an animal." She looked at him the way you look at something that doesn't make sense. Not angry, just confused, like he had said something in the wrong language, and she was trying to figure out what he actually meant. "Your people and mine have been killing each other for 11 years, she said. "Yeah," Jake said, "and you're still not an animal." He pulled up a chair and sat down outside the cell. Not close enough to be stupid about it, just close enough to talk. He didn't even fully understand why. Maybe it was the quiet down there. Maybe he was just tired of eating dinner alone at the end of every miserable day. Maybe something about the way she had read that death sentence and folded it neatly was still sitting in the back of his head and hadn't left yet. They didn't have a deep conversation that first night. Jake asked if the food was okay. Vera said it was acceptable. Jake said good. Long silence. He left, but he came back the next morning. And the morning after that. By the third day, they were actually talking. Not about the war, not at first. Jake asked her about the Valkyrie home system, because he had always been curious, and nobody back at command actually knew much about it. Vera answered, carefully at first, like she was checking every word before she let it out. But she answered. She asked him why humans fought the way they did. Emotional, unpredictable, throwing themselves into situations that made no tactical sense. Jake laughed a little at that and said, because sometimes the math tells you to quit and your gut tells you not to, and we usually listen to our gut. She didn't laugh, but something shifted slightly in her expression, like a door that had been locked for a long time had moved just a fraction of an inch. The thing that clearly bothered her the most was the honor question. In the Valkyrie Empire, honor was tied completely to victory. You won, you had honor. You lost, you had nothing. It was that simple, that cold, that final. Jake didn't see it that way, and he told her so. He said that the way someone fights matters more than whether they win. That doing the right thing when it costs you something is the whole point. Vera was quiet for a long time after that. That is not logical, she finally said. No, Jake agreed, but it's true. She had no answer for that, and from the look on her face, that fact bothered her more than anything else that had happened since she was captured. She was a general. She was trained to solve problems, to find angles, to counter every argument with a better one. Jake Miller, a tired captain eating cold food outside a prison cell, had just said something she could not counter. She hated that more than she expected to. The envoy arrived on a Thursday morning. Jake was drinking his coffee when the ship came in low over the base. No weapons visible. No escort. Just a single clean vessel with imperial markings, moving slow and deliberate like it owned the air it was flying through. Jake watched it land from a window. He had known this moment was coming. He had known it since the day the execution order arrived. He had 7 days to think about it. 7 days to talk himself into being professional about it. 7 days to remind himself that this was not his call to make and not his war to fight alone. 7 days had not helped. He put his coffee down and walked downstairs. The envoy was already at the base entrance by the time Jake reached the lower level. 2 of them, tall, formal uniforms, faces completely unreadable. They had paperwork. Of course they had paperwork. The Empire never did anything without paperwork. They handed it to the base administrator with the kind of calm confidence that comes from people who have never been told no in their entire lives. Jake walked past all of it and stood in front of Vera's cell door. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there, feet shoulder-width apart, arms crossed, back straight, and waited. The envoy noticed him about 30 seconds later. The taller one walked over and explained, in very polite and very cold language, that they were here on official imperial business, and that he needed to step aside so they could collect the prisoner. Jake looked at him and said nothing. The envoy tried again, more formal this time, citing specific codes and authorizations. Jake listened to all of it. Then he continued to say nothing and continued to not move. That was when Colonel Dave Reed showed up. Reed was Jake's commanding officer and one of the most level-headed people Jake had ever served under. He was also clearly furious, which for Reed meant his jaw was tight and his voice was about 3 tones quieter than usual. He pulled Jake a few steps to the side and spoke low and direct. Miller, I need you to tell me you understand what you're doing right now. Yes, sir, Jake said. And you're still going to stand there. Yes, sir. Reed stared at him for a long moment. She is not one of ours. This is not our jurisdiction. What happens to her is an internal imperial matter, and it is completely outside the boundary of anything you or I have the authority to interfere with. Do you understand that? I do, sir. Then stand down, Captain. Jake looked straight ahead at the cell door. I can't do that, sir. Reed closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and said very carefully, Give me a reason. One reason I can actually use. Jake thought about it. He thought about Vera reading that paper and folding it quietly. He thought about her sitting across from him asking questions that nobody had ever bothered to ask her before. He thought about a system that called losing a crime worth dying for, and a general who had served that system her whole life, and was only now in a human prison cell. Hearing someone tell her that maybe the whole thing was wrong. She didn't lose because she was weak. Jake said, she lost because we were good. There's a difference, and executing her for that isn't justice. It's just the Empire being embarrassed. Reed had no answer for that. Neither did the envoy. Nobody moved Jake Miller that morning. He just stood there, arms crossed, completely still, in front of that cell door. A single tired captain with no authority, no backup plan, and no intention of going anywhere. Sometimes that's all it takes. Jake had not slept much in the past week. Not because of stress, although there was plenty of that. Mostly because he had been reading. It started 3 days before the envoy arrived. Jake had a feeling, not a plan yet, just a feeling, that standing in front of that cell door, without something solid behind him, would only buy Vera maybe an hour before they physically removed him and took her anyway. Feelings don't stop empires, but laws sometimes do. So he started digging. He got access to the Imperial War Code through a military database that most people on base didn't even know existed. It had been compiled decades ago by a team of human diplomats trying to understand how the Valkyrie Empire operated internally. Most of it was dry, dense, and written in a formal style that made legal documents look exciting. Jake read every page anyway. He made notes on a legal pad. He crossed things out. He circled things. He drank bad coffee and kept reading. On the 4th night, he found it. It was buried in a section near the back, between 2 paragraphs about fleet salvage rights and prisoner transport protocols. Easy to miss. Written in language so old and formal that Jake had to read it 4 times to make sure he understood it correctly. But it was there, clear as anything once you found it. The clause was ancient. It came from a time when the Valkyrie Empire fought wars very differently, when individual combat still mattered, and capturing an enemy commander was considered a significant act. The clause stated that a captor who had taken a high-ranking enemy prisoner in direct engagement had the right to formally claim that prisoner's life debt. It was a legal transfer of responsibility. Once claimed, the Empire could not execute the prisoner without first going to the captor, and the process for contesting a life debt claim was long, complicated, and required approval from multiple levels of imperial authority. It wasn't a rescue. It was a delay wrapped inside a legal argument, wrapped inside the Empire's own rulebook. Jake wrote up the formal challenge that same night. He kept it clean and precise. He cited the exact clause, the exact paragraph, the exact line. He listed the circumstances of Vera's capture, confirmed that his unit had taken her in direct engagement, and formally invoked his right as primary captor. He signed it, dated it, and had it witnessed by 2 people on base who had absolutely no idea what they were signing, but trusted Jake enough not to ask too many questions. When the envoy arrived and the standoff happened, and Colonel Reed asked him for one good reason, Jake already had the paperwork in his jacket pocket. He handed it over after the envoy's second attempt to move him. The taller envoy read it, then read it again. He passed it to the second envoy, who read it with the careful expression of someone who has just stepped on something unexpected and is trying to figure out exactly what it was. They stepped away and made a call. Jake waited. It took about 20 minutes. When the envoy came back, his face was completely neutral in the specific way that people go neutral when they are angry but have no good move left. He confirmed, in very clipped and precise language, that the claim was being logged and that the execution order was suspended pending Imperial review. Then he left. Reed stood next to Jake and watched the envoy's ship lift off through the small window at the end of the corridor. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said quietly, "You used their own law." "They wrote it," Jake said. Seemed fair. Reed made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. You know they're going to come back at you hard for this." Jake nodded. He knew. He had known since the first night. He sat down outside that cell with a spare food tray and a question he couldn't stop asking himself. He had known it was going to cost him something. He had just decided the cost was worth it before he fully understood what the price would be. But Vera was still in that cell, still alive, still breathing. For now, that was enough. The Imperial review took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of paperwork, formal inquiries, legal back and forth between human military command and Valkyrie Imperial Administration. 6 weeks of meetings Jake was not invited to, decisions being made above his head, and people in expensive uniforms arguing over a clause written so long ago that half of them hadn't even known it existed before Jake dug it up. Jake spent most of those 6 weeks doing routine-based work and waiting. He was called in for questioning 3 times. Each time he sat down, answered every question honestly, and walked back out. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself beyond what was necessary. He had done what he did for the reasons he did it, and he wasn't going to dress that up in language that made it sound like anything other than exactly what it was. At the end of the 6th week, the ruling came through. The life debt claim was valid. The execution order was formally suspended. Vera would be released into a neutral zone under a temporary status that the Empire's legal system had no clean category for. She wasn't a free citizen. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't an active military officer. She was something the Empire had never had to define before, and the paperwork around her release reflected that confusion in every awkward line of it. She walked out of that base on a gray Tuesday morning. Jake was there. He didn't make a big moment out of it. He just stood near the exit with his hands in his pockets and watched her walk past the gate. She stopped when she reached him. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that people do when they said a lot of important things to each other through iron bars. And now, suddenly, there are no bars, and neither person quite knows what the normal version of this is supposed to look like. Vera said, "You could have lost everything." Jake said, "I know." She nodded once. Then she walked away. Jake lost quite a bit. As it turned out, he was demoted within the month. Captain became lieutenant. The official reason was procedural, something about unauthorized interference with Allied diplomatic process. Everyone on base knew what it was actually about. Some of them were angry on his behalf. Some of them quietly shook his hand in the corridor and didn't say anything, which meant more. Colonel Reed wrote him a letter. Personal, not official. Short. It said that in 30 years of service, Reed had seen a lot of soldiers make hard calls, and that most of them made the safe call instead when it really counted. He said Jake had done something rare. He didn't call it brave. He called it honest. Jake folded the letter and kept it. The war went on for another 3 years after that. Then it stopped. The peace talks happened on a neutral station. Representatives from both sides. Months of careful, difficult conversation. Jake wasn't there. He was back on active duty by then, a different posting, far from the politics of it all. He heard about the treaty the same way most people did, through a broadcast on a screen in a common room, surrounded by people who went quiet and then slowly started to breathe again. He almost missed the detail that everyone else seemed to be talking about the next morning. The lead Valkyrie negotiator had conducted the entire peace process in English, not through a translator, not with an aide helping. Alone, in fluent, clean, careful English, every session, every document, every word. Her name was Vera. Nobody on the human side could explain it. Journalists asked. Officials speculated. It became one of those strange footnotes that people argue about for years without ever landing on a clean answer. Jake heard about it and smiled into his coffee and didn't say a word. He didn't need to explain it. Some things make complete sense if you know where they started. A spare food tray, a cold chair outside a prison cell, a man who sat down when he didn't have to and said something honest when it would have been much easier to say nothing at all. That's where it started. That's where everything changed.